We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Now on BBC One Panorama, as European space ministers meet today and tomorrow to plan the future, Stephen Bradshaw reports on the choices facing Britain in space.
Attention pour décompte final. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, top!
For weeks, Britain has agonized over a policy for space. Today in Holland, Britain called on its European partners to review their whole space program. They're planning for the year 2000. Most are enthusiastic, but the British are skeptical. Is space the gateway to the future or a black hole for taxpayers' money? The British can't agree. The Europeans fear we're adrift in space. One man who will not be in Holland this week is Roy Gibson. He was picked by the government to draw up Britain's policy for space. But this summer he resigned, frustrated by Britain's reluctance to make the commitment he wanted. Now he's tidying his garden, selling his home and looking forward to retirement, his vision of the future unfulfilled.
What I thought and what I still think is that we could play a major role in getting Europe's space plan together and perhaps doing something very exciting in the next 10 or 20 years.
Why is it important for Britain to have a stake in space?
Well, space has become very relevant to all sorts of things in our everyday life. It's not just a matter of looking at the stars or even looking at the Earth. It really is an important part of our high technology life.
So what's at stake?
Perhaps the whole future of the UK as a high-tech nation.
Space, say those who agree with Roy Gibson, is the new continent. For Britain to ignore space, they claim, would be like Elizabethans turning their backs on America, like Victorians refusing to build railways. What man does in space, they say, can benefit everyone on Earth. Satellites, the space lobby argue, prove that space is not a scientist's playground. Today it carries pictures and phone calls across the world. In the future, they say, satellites will tell farmers where to sow, fishermen where to fish, and oilmen where to drill. And the strange properties of weightlessness, it's claimed, could help man produce new metals or drugs, with nations that aren't in space left far behind. There's down-to-earth evidence of the benefits of space here in London's East End. One of the specialists at the London Hospital is Tony Good. He's also a consultant for NASA. He's already using knowledge learned in space to heal ulcers.
Well, medically, we know what happens now when the man goes up there. We're now at the exciting point where we want to exploit what does happen and actually make that of benefit to the earthbound patient. New drugs, new understanding of basic body mechanisms and physiology, and really a new look, really, at medicine.
It's a vision of space helping those who most need it, not just scientists in the space industry. And scarcely 2 years ago, it was a vision in which Britain seemed ready to increase its investment.
This is a very exciting time for space in the European scene, on the European scene, and a very important day for the space industry in Britain.
November 1985, Geoffrey Patty sets up Britain's own National Space Centre. Its director, Roy Gibson.
I mean, the fact that we're here today is a clear recognition in government circles, and coming from very clearly from the Prime Minister herself, of the importance of space as
High above the Thames in the Department of Industry, Roy Gibson set to work on a national space plan. He presented the government with a series of options to bring Britain more into line with its partners in the European Space Agency. This year, Britain will spend just £112 million on space. Italy, £294 million. Germany, £375 million. And France, £590 million.
No one must slack.
Mrs. Thatcher herself, it said, favoured some increase in space spending. But after the election, space had to compete with other priorities in the Department of Industry's budget. Geoffrey Patty was fired, and Mrs. Thatcher's new team were to prove more sceptical of the case for space.
The government's extremely keen on this country's prestige and this country's involvement in high-tech and this country's involvement in scientific research. We also have a reputation as a sensible government that chooses its priorities and insists that if you are going to spend money in this kind of area, there should be value for money for the British taxpayer and British industry.
The crucial sign that the government's interest in space was increasingly tempered by financial concern came a month after the election from Mrs. Thatcher herself.
It is quite correct that we have not been able to find the considerable amount of extra expenditure that was requested.
And she went on,
we shall continue our subscription to the European Space Agency, but at present we're not able to find more money. I hope that private sector, if it is interested in the results from such research, will itself come forward with considerable resources.
How did you react when you heard Mrs. Thatcher's statement in the Commons? In fact, how did you hear it? Did you read it in the papers, or how?
Yes, I read it in the papers the following day.
And how did you react?
Oh, I was disappointed. I hadn't expected such a public announcement.
Did it come as a surprise? As a shock?
As a surprise, yes, yes.
And what did you do then?
Well, after I'd confirmed that no more money at present really meant no more money at present, I could see that this would mean that some of the programs would have to stop, and I decided to resign.
What explains this extraordinary change between the commitment to space in 1985 and the statements 2 years later that there won't be any more money?
It's very difficult to know the answer to that. I think one has to accept that those of us that have had the earlier responsibility haven't been as successful as we might be in selling the importance of space around government departments. I think that the whole subject has fallen foul of the different government departments having their own budgets to protect, so that if there is going to be more money, one has to say, well, which government department is going to give up a slice of its budget, and everybody just sits there waiting for someone else to do it. And incredible though it may seem as a way to run something, that is actually how it goes.
In his previous job, Roy Gibson had been director of the European Space Agency, running Europe's space program. So the message his story sent to Britain's partners in space was clear.
I think his appointment was a signal, really, not just in Europe, but as far afield as Tokyo, Moscow and Washington, that we meant business in space. And his departure, I'm afraid, will give a contrary signal.
What kind of signal?
Well, it'll give the signal that apparently we don't mean business in space.
On the Cumbrian moors, a bleak reminder that Britain used to be the leading space power in Europe. 25 years ago, this was the test bed where engineers carried out trials on Britain's own rocket engine, a symbol of its political commitment to a future in space.
This is a new sound, the sound of a space age, the sound of the Blue Streak rocket.
Blue Streak began life as Britain's own ballistic nuclear missile. When the military version was scrapped in 1960, it survived as the first stage of a European satellite launcher. From Woomera in Australia, it was fired successfully 10 times out of 10. But costs escalated. The Treasury said Britain should invest in more commercial ventures. In the late 60s, Blue Streak was finally cancelled. Britain also tried to go it alone with Black Arrow, the son of Blue Streak. In 1971, Black Arrow launched Prospero, the only time Britain put its own satellite into orbit. But the government saw little future for a satellite launcher. It had already decided to cancel. Britain even dreamt up its own space shuttle, the long-forgotten Mustard. 3 almost identical spacecraft would take off together. Just one would fly into orbit. But Mustard would have cost billions of pounds. And while industry drew up the plans, government declined to develop them. Treasury officials of the time still believe each decision was financially justified. But Blue Streak's project manager maintains that in the long run, Britain lost more from the cancellations than it saved.
We lost at least 3 things. Firstly, we lost a product. Blue Streak, as the first stage of a vehicle, would now be selling very handsomely on a commercial basis. Secondly, we lost access to the technology, because the technology which goes into a rocket vehicle is extremely important and covers a very wide range of things. So we lost access to a wide range of those technologies. And thirdly, we lost confidence. We lost confidence by the people in this country and abroad that Britain intended to stay in the leading edge of high-performance rocket engines and the general technology that went with it. Together, we lost a lot.
But when Britain abandoned the rocket business, others took over.
Prêt pour l'essai de performance des chaînes de puissance?
Prêt.
C'est parti.
The Aerospatiale rocket plant near Paris, a vision of what Britain might have been in space. Since America's shuttle disaster, the Ariane rocket has become the world's most successful satellite launcher, marketed by Europe's own space rocket consortium, Arianespace.
The order book is, in the present time, 30 launchers from the 20th to the 49th.
Those are firm orders.
There are firm orders, and in the present time, we are discussing with Arianespace 50 more orders.
So that's 80 possible launches.
Yes, and this 80 possible launcher should be launched until 96 or 97.
So you've got business till 1997?
Yes, it is very exceptional.
The French say their space industry has now brought them some 10,000 jobs. France builds Ariane with its European partners. The French stake 59%, Britain's just 2.5%. The French don't dwell on the cost of developing Ariane. It's money they're happy to write off, so France can have a space industry and a leading role in the European Space Agency. For Roy Gibson, Ariane is a model of the kind of role he'd like to see Britain play. A long-term commitment to the European space industry, which the French have kept to despite the enormous and probably unquantifiable cost.
They've known exactly what they wanted to see done, either by Europe or in France. They've made a few compromises, but not very many. And we've tagged along behind, largely.
But does all this really make money?
No, of itself it doesn't. I don't think there's anybody who's really making money out of making launchers as such. But if you really want to set your mind on something big in space, the big problem is getting from here to space and back again. And launchers are the essential part of that. Otherwise, you're a hostage.
But are the French doing this simply for political prestige?
No. They're doing it because they damn well believe that you've got to get into space and you've got to have the means of doing it under your own European control.
The French space program is controlled from the headquarters of CNES, the French National Space Centre. Its director, Frédéric Deleiste, is in close contact with Prime Minister Jacques Chirac. Unlike Roy Gibson, Monsieur Deleiste has had the political backing to make his vision a reality.
Bien, nous allons maintenant parler des résultats du Conseil de l'Agence spatiale européenne.
At the weekly board meeting, the French discussed their strategy for this week's space summit.
Destiné à préparer donc ces décisions.
They're also finalizing plans for the next Ariane launch, with a direct radio link to French Guiana.
Vous avez des commentaires sur le déroulement des opérations?
Non, tout est parfaitement nominal.
At Kourou, on the South American mainland, the French have even set up their own launch complex in Uncle Sam's backyard. Like every Ariane launch, it'll be a matter of French pride and of French policy. For behind its space empire is a strategic vision of France's national interest.
For any nation who is concerned by its technological development, by its scientific development, by the international role it aims at playing on the world scene, it is, we think, a must to be a space power.
And if you are not?
Well, it is a matter of political decision, but if you are not, it is certainly a real burden and a drawback in the international cooperation and in the development of the potential industry in this field.
Having decided they must be in space, the French are now doing everything on Earth to make it pay. Switzerland, and for Frédéric Deleist, a vital business trip. The head of France's space centre is also boss of Arianespace, the rocket marketing company. He's both civil servant and salesman. The Geneva Telecom Fair, and the French are coming. Ariane order books may stretch into the 1990s, but the world's communication industry is clamouring for still more satellite launches. Frédéric Deleist's presence here is a reminder the French want space to mean profits as well as prestige. But they say there can be no profits without government investment.
First, you need a policy, a long-term policy with high risk to go to this new frontier of space. And this is to be led by the government. Then from this you can derive certain commercial result. It is very important to pay a big effort to get the best out of the technology which you have developed. But neither in Soviet Union, nor in the United States, nor in Japan, nor in China, nor in India, and not in France, you can support space policy only by short-term result of commercial entities.
There's a perfect example of how that policy works at Matra in Toulouse, France's space city. Matra makes satellites for Ariane to launch, and it's been carefully nurtured with government orders. This one is for the next generation of the Earth observation satellite called Spot.
You can see that the infrared histogram is quite short.
The company that uses Spot is just down the road. Its technology the most sophisticated of its kind in the West.
The red histogram, which is displaying green.
The computer takes messages from the satellite and creates a detailed picture of the Earth's surface.
The town, which appears
in blue with the gardens, you're in red.
Spotimage sells its pictures throughout the world. They're an advert for France as a high-tech nation. Foreign customers may end up ordering a French ground station, or if the maps show they need one, a French bridge or a French irrigation scheme.
Vegetation on the mountains.
French taxpayers will have to subsidize Spot for at least a decade, but it's a bill they seem happy to pay.
We have made several polls and survey of the public opinion in space matters, and we can say clearly that we have a good support. You have always critics, and you have always some people against it, but the majority is supporting this venture.
The French are not leaving public support to chance. The government's even set up a network of clubs where the taxpayers of the future can build and launch their own rockets.
The purpose of the experimental activities is twofold. First, the young boys and girls learn about space technology and activities, and maybe later they will like to work for space. And the second purpose is public awareness. By seeing such events, they learn more directly what it is about, and then they will be ready to pay tax. So we educate the taxpayer for a better future in space for all of us.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, feu!
The origin of the French commitment to space is at the heart of their government system. The École Polytechnique is France's elite technological university. It's old boys, France's high-tech ruling class. It's run on strict military lines that date back to Napoleon. Over half the board of France's space centres studied here. At the École, they're taught that France's ambitions in space are not merely a matter of profit and loss, but of national destiny.
Dans ces plis, plusieurs inscriptions en lettres d'or.
The lesson from the military director: students should dedicate themselves to science, their country, and glory.
Pour la patrie, les sciences et la gloire.
And since its graduates run the space industry and the government departments which pay for it, France's commitment to space seems assured.
In the French system, an engineer who has made these high schools, écoles, may spend 5 years on the administration side, in the public service, another 5 years in industry, another 5 years on a test site of a national laboratory, then come back to industry. So on the one side, he has all that experience, has seen the things from the two sides of the fence, and by the other way, they also know each other.
What effect has that had on the French space program?
Oh, it had the effect that there had been a great continuity, and I would even say also an efficiency. And it has another effect, for instance, that the space budget has never had greater cuts. There had been revisions sometimes when there was a change of government, whether the space program was all right, and every time after such re-examination, which took a few months, the conclusion was, yes, we go ahead in the same way. Since 25 years, always continuity.
In Britain, the relations between the space industry and government are very different. In Brighton last month, Britain played host to the world's most distinguished gathering of space experts. The head of NASA, James Fletcher, American astronaut Buzz Aldrin, and, still looking for his place in the space world, Roy Gibson. But on opening day, no government minister. Congress officials felt snubbed.
As in other countries, it's normally ministers, the Minister of Science and Research, for example, last year in Austria, and I don't remember any of these congresses I have attended where there wasn't an official of the government who was opening this conference.
On the third day, Junior Minister John Butcher came to call, hoping to clarify the government's position. The message: Britain was concerned about the gung-ho attitude of Europe's space lobby. The government would not judge the industry on short-term profit and loss, but did expect it to play a bigger part in future space developments. It was a message that had been rammed home on television 2 nights earlier by the senior Minister for Space.
Well, if they can't raise their money from the banks and they want to raise the money from you and me, the taxpayer, instead, they can't complain about the taxpayer asking questions about exactly how long are you talking about, what kind of return and when. And if, in fact, there are demonstrable commercial returns, then at the very least the private sector should contribute. It is no good just saying this is rather high-risk stuff, so we're not going to risk our own money. It's got to be the taxpayers' money instead.
The government's insistence on value for money and its present freeze on funding had an immediate effect on this Oxfordshire estate. Alan Bond is Britain's top rocket engineer. For years on his personal computer, he's been making the calculations that could put Britain back at the top of the European Space League. As a teenager, Alan Bond tried to launch his own rockets, but there was no French rocket club to inspire him, just his childhood hero.
In my early teens, I'd been carrying out some studies of rockets, and finally, after building 300 cardboard and gunpowder devices, decided I knew enough to build something like this. On my 16th birthday, I applied for permission to launch it. I went to the local police station, and straight away we ran into problems because nobody knew which government department was supposed to look after amateur rockets. It ended finally with Her Majesty's Inspector of Explosives descending on me and telling me that I was contravening the Explosives Act of 1875. So following that, a group of colleagues and myself went underground, and we successfully tested about 54 rockets altogether, static tests and flight tests, with finally reaching altitudes of about 3 miles.
What did this experience tell you about building rockets in Britain?
Well, it told me that it was very difficult to do anything in Britain which goes into space. But in more recent times, of course, on a much more serious basis, I realised just how deep that problem really is.
Alan Bond's inventive genius has led him to what may be a revolutionary discovery, HOTOL. It's a spaceship that takes off like an ordinary aeroplane, breathing oxygen in the atmosphere, then switching to oxygen in its own fuel tanks in space. British industry is now putting Bond's ideas to the test in the hope that HOTOL could cut satellite launch costs by 80%. The trials have cost £3 million, but the government's half share dried up after it restricted space spending. At Brighton, there was already talk of Britain doing another blue streak. HOTOL may arouse the admiration of America's second man on the moon, but to an economy-minded government, it's a long-term project with an unproven technology. It's echoes of Concorde with its spiralling costs, not blue streak, that worry Mrs. Thatcher's ministers. With other countries catching up on Alan Bond's invention, there's understanding in the space industry for his anger at the way public funds were cut off. So how did he feel about the government's attitude?
Very let down, I think, is the first thing I have to say. I also feel that to some degree the industry has been insulted in that, having carried out something which we thought was what was being asked for, we're then not given the government support at the end of the day.
Why do you need government support?
If we go ahead and build this type of space plane, Britain will benefit, not just British Aerospace or Rolls-Royce, and therefore I feel that the British taxpayer has a moral obligation to support that sort of research, to pay part of the bill if they're going to get the returns back, maybe 15 or 20 years, but they can't expect companies to stand out of that for that period of time.
British Aerospace argue there's already evidence in Britain to show that public investment in space can pay off. Britain's satellite industry is among the most successful in the world, even though the original investment was an act of faith. In 1958, months after the Russians launched their first Sputnik, the British government commissioned a report on whether it too should invest in a satellite program. The report admitted it is difficult at this stage to predict practical benefits which may ensue from a United Kingdom artificial satellite program. Yet the report recommended investment and the government went ahead, a leap in the dark that led directly to today's highly commercial satellite industry. Britain's confidence in space in the 50s has given it a leading edge in satellite technology. Now firms like British Aerospace are calling for a similar act of faith in what they see as the new technologies of the next century.
The payback is that our participation in the future exploitation of space, and the unfortunate thing is that I cannot give you the hard monetary return that is going to generate. I just have this feeling, and it's not alone, I'm not alone in having it, that if we are not part of this with all the technology we possess to be a part of it, then we shall regret it.
But why should the British taxpayer put his money at risk when you and your banks aren't willing to?
Well, simply because there are various things in life where commercial opportunity is just not possible. The risk and long-term nature of the business doesn't justify any of us actually putting our hands into our private pockets and investing in this kind of thing, because the payback is so long, and you can't expect the kind of system to react to those opportunities.
But why should you expect the taxpayer?
Because the taxpayer, of course, invests in all long-term infrastructure programs within the community which have got a period of payback of over 25 or 30 years. There isn't any other way of doing it.
At Westminster, the arguments of the space lobby and the government are coming under careful scrutiny in the House of Lords. Its Science Committee is holding an inquiry into Britain's policy for space.
To that extent, you are dependent on other people.
The committee includes experts on the economy, defence and industry. It's calling witnesses from Whitehall and from the space industry. It'll draw up its formal conclusions later in the year. Lord Chorley is a city economist and an independent peer whose views are said to be close to those held in Downing Street.
What have you made so far of the space lobby's claims for the commercial and technological possibilities of space?
Well, to be honest, not very much. I mean, they tend to proceed by way of rather sort of grandiose assertions that, you know, the technological future of this country in the 21st century depends on being in space. Some of the bits of evidence that one could quote, I mean, are really quite almost bizarre, I would say. What technologies are we talking about? Why can you only get these technologies by going up in space? Do you really have to do it in space? Can you do some of these things better on the ground?
The space industry said that this is an act of faith which we must make in order to develop the technologies of the future.
You still need plenty of an act of faith, but I mean, that's no substitute for also doing some homework.
But while the British debate their policy for space, the French are already plotting their next move. At Arianespace, they're developing a flight simulator for Hermes, a European space shuttle. The French believe Hermes could mean manned spaceflight for Europe by the year 2000. But for the British government, it's a luxury which Europe can ill afford. Its payload is small, and its estimated cost has already doubled. Unlike HOTOL, Hermes has to be launched by a rocket. By today's standards, its critics say, it's a low-tech spacecraft with no long-term future. But Hermes has a powerful backer, Frédéric Dall'Est, head of France's space empire. And when the European Space Agency meets, it's the French who have the financial clout. It's Hermes, not HOTOL, that's top of Monsieur Dall'Est's agenda. The British dilemma is on what terms to stay in a program so heavily influenced by the French. On the table this week is a range of ambitious new projects known to some as ESA's menu gastronomique. First on the menu, Hermes, the mini-shuttle. The cost, £2.8 billion. Next, Ariane 5, the launcher planned to put huge loads into space, including Hermes. Total cost, £2.2 billion. And third, Columbus, the European contribution to the space station planned by the Americans. Cost £2.5 billion. Each nation can choose which project it wants to back. ESA will hand out work according to the size of each country's contribution. Britain's main interest so far has been in Columbus with its laboratories of the future. But this week, Britain will question not just the space station's likely benefits, but the entire ESA program.
We don't like what the Space Agency have put forward because it's very expensive. We believe that it needs to be rethought and that we do need to have a look at greater commercial involvement and just consider really exactly what the strategy is before we go into this highly expensive, I think not altogether well-directed space effort. The man in the street expects ministers to evaluate these hugely expensive claims, to work out whether these vast sums of money are justifiable compared with all the other ways we could spend money, not only in health, education, but in other areas of science and research and supporting British industry. And until and unless these enthusiasts at home and abroad satisfy us there's good value for money and proper scope for commercial exploitation of the results and room for our private companies to go in and our private companies willing to put their money in, I think it's the duty of ministers to say we admire your enthusiasm, but that bill is simply too much.
The English minister, Mr. Kenneth Clarke, has called the European Space Agency an expensive club. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is, I think, the same as the reaction of a number of my European colleagues. I have been shocked by this statement. The European Space Agency is probably one of the rare successful examples of technological cooperation in Europe. European Space Agency is a necessity. It has been a success with a reasonable amount of money and very modest one as compared to the Americans or to the Soviets. So I think this statement is really unfair and certainly has been going too far.
So what could be the consequences if Britain decided to back away from Europe's space program as it's presently conceived? The most obvious problem would be at stake in the Polar Platform, an Earth observation satellite which British Aerospace hoped to build for the Columbus program. From its polar orbit, it could take snapshots of the Earth showing details just a meter across. The Polar Platform is particularly important for one of Britain's sunrise industries, remote sensing. It's a way of finding information about the Earth from observation satellites. This firm in Maidenhead used satellite data to fight a disease called river blindness by showing doctors where to spray insecticides. Now they're helping to monitor Afghan refugee settlements to prevent famine and disease. The government takes the remote sensing industry seriously, funding research at a rate of over £10 million a year. But the industry says that to replace old machines with new computer equipment, it needs confidence in the future. And that means a clear decision on space projects like Columbus. What will the space station, the Columbus project, what would it mean to your company?
Well, it will mean that we'll be having much more high-resolution data, which will enable us to produce much larger scale maps in much more detail. We're looking at resolutions that are 10 times better than we're getting at the moment. It will go a long way to replacing traditional aerial photography by the mid-1990s. And if we don't have access to those satellite systems, we're going to be out on a limb.
Further into the future, scientists say the next area for commercial exploitation of space will be weightlessness. Experiments on the space station could lead to new vaccines, drugs or alloys. There are many skeptics who say investment in earthbound research is of more value, but others fear the consequences if Britain pulls out of Columbus.
We're now coming into the next century, and traditionally Britain has been an adventurous nation, and we're sailing on a new sea. Like any voyage of exploration, you can never be sure what you're going to find at the end, although the suggestions are that there might be many applications for medicine, in particular in my own field, which are bound to be of benefit to earthbound patients. But at the present, we seem to be opting out, and inevitably that means we'll have to buy the expertise and the exploitation. And as it'll be a monopoly supplier, it's going to be very expensive.
If the government refuses to back Europe's plans, the space industry warns that Britain could let the technologies of the future pass by. Skeptics say that's bluff from a space lobby that wants taxpayers' money with no foreseeable return. The government wants more private investment, but critics say it must first decide on a more consistent policy.
It's not that they have a divine right to get a subsidy, but they do have a right to know where government stands over a long period. It's the stop-go nature of government decisions which really causes them trouble. I think you can justify saying no space, no expenditure, and take it from there, boys. If you want to do it, you do it yourselves. Or at the other end, you can do what the French have done and tell people what you're going to do for 10 or 15 years ahead. In the UK, we've the worst of both worlds. Sometimes we put money in, sometimes we don't. So academia, industry, and private sector in general never really knows from one year to next what the flavour of the month is going to be.
In French Guiana, the next Ariane rocket stands ready to put a European television satellite into orbit 9 days from now. For the British, it will symbolise the kind of space policy which successive governments have shunned: high-rise investment and unwavering commitment, however uncertain the return. The alternatives for Britain are stark. Britain can abandon space, as it once did Blue Streak. It can try and persuade Europe to adopt what it sees as a more realistic policy at the right price. But the space industry fears that if Britain does not make a firm commitment, the ultimate price could be far higher.